Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Sue Spinello, and I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I'm here to tell you about my dad, George Kennedy. When I was growing up, I knew that my dad was a survivor, but I didn't really know what that meant. All I knew was that he had a foreign accent, he was older than all of my friends' parents, and that I was a Jewish girl growing up in the north suburbs of Chicago with an Irish Catholic last name. It wasn't until 1978, when the TV miniseries The Holocaust came out, and I sat on the couch watching it with my dad, that he began to tell me his story. Later, he said he didn't tell me earlier because he didn't want to scare me. So this is a picture of my dad one year at Thanksgiving. And this is a picture of him shortly after getting out of concentration camps. Notice his blank stare? He said he didn't know what the word smile meant. I want to start out by telling one story that I think epitomizes my dad and explains why it was he was able to survive. When my dad got a letter telling him to report to the railroad station in 3 days' time, he didn't know where he was going, for how long, or if he would be coming home. As you may know, the Nazis were masters at deception. But he packed his backpack, his mom gave him some food, his dad gave him some money, the equivalent to about $4 today, and told him to keep that money for extreme emergencies only. And there were many times throughout the year that my dad was in concentration camps that he could have used that money to buy a loaf of bread. But he saved it, knowing there might come a time when he could only get a slice of bread for that money, but that slice would save his life. And you know what? He never spent it, just knowing that the money was there, hidden in plain sight, surviving many searches, including complete strip searches. Just knowing that the money was there gave him the mental strength to survive. He told himself, unless a bullet gets me, I'm coming home. As far as he knew, his parents were there, and he needed to get home to them. Let's now meet my dad and hear why he felt Holocaust education was so important.
When I was asked to first talk about my experiences, I was very happy about it, and I'm still happy, because I feel that talking about it, one, I consider myself a winner. They are not here, I am here, in spite of what happened. I feel that my surviving demonstrated that I won. And I'm very happy to talk about my experiences because that makes you think, that makes you believe that safety can happen here, can happen in Nebraska, in southern Rhodesia, it can happen any place, and we have to watch for it so it doesn't happen here.
Dad passed away in 2010. It is now my legacy, my privilege to tell his story for him. George Kennedy was born Gyorgi Ungar on November 5, 1923 in Budapest, Hungary. He was the only child of Miklós Ungar, nicknamed Moore, and Hermina Schick Ungar, nicknamed Mimi. He grew up in a one-bedroom, one-bath, decent apartment in Budapest, Hungary. They didn't have a car or a telephone, but neither did anyone else. They lived an ordinary middle-class life. They went to theater, concerts, movies. They visited relatives in a neighboring town on Sundays. My dad had a rowboat on the Danube River. They went on vacations. Here they are in Bulgaria in 1933. And here they're at a resort area near the Danube when Dad was 15 years old. My dad's dad worked for the Hungarian Transit Authority, kind of like our CTA. His mom was a homemaker. Other relatives were electricians, sheet metal workers, shoemakers. Both his parents' families had lived in Hungary for generations and didn't have relatives anywhere else. I want to go over some history to give you a context within which to see my dad's experiences, especially because Hungary's story isn't as well known as countries like Germany and Poland. In 1940, Hungary had a population of about 10 million, and 2/3 of those people were Catholic. Jews made up approximately 6% of the population. The country was very anti-Semitic. They didn't like Jews, but it didn't really affect my dad and his family all that much. Hungarian Jews were very assimilated. They didn't speak Yiddish, the Jewish language. They spoke Hungarian and sometimes German. They considered themselves Hungarians whose religion was Judaism. In November 1940, Hungary entered World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. And for a while, Hitler and the Nazis didn't put any pressure on Hungary to enact anti-Jewish laws. People, including my dad's family, said that what was happening in the rest of Europe couldn't possibly happen in their country, that the Germans were such cultured and educated people, they wouldn't do such things in Hungary. But by 1941, life started to be more difficult under German influence. Jewish restrictive laws were passed, modeled after Germany's Nuremberg laws. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Jews lost their citizenships. Jews were thrown out of the government, people lost their jobs, stores were closed down, signs appeared stating, "Dogs and Jews not wanted." Universities admitted only selected Jews, mostly those who had converted to Christianity.
I wanted to go to university. The Hungarians were breaking Jewish restrictive laws. They called it numerus clausus, which means closed number in Latin. That they said there are 6% Jews in this country, we will accept only up to 6% Jews in universities. Of course, they didn't accept even the 6%. They took the 6% out of the number of converted Jews, Jews who became Christians. I wasn't one of them.
Not being able to enroll in university, my dad became a bricklayer. After 30 years of working for the same company, his dad was fired and his retirement benefits weren't paid. His office mate said to him,
They said, "Don't worry, if anything happens here, anything bad, we will protect you. You are our favorite Jew." Then when things got tough, all of a sudden the same people said, "You must understand, in times like that, you cannot stand up for the Jew."
By 1943, Germany was applying increasing pressure on the Hungarian government to ghettoize and deport its Jewish population. Hungary consistently resisted these demands. As a result, Hungary's Jews found themselves in a unique situation. While millions of Jews across Europe were being shot to death or gassed, most Hungarian Jews, though living under harsh daily conditions, didn't feel that their lives were in danger. But by early 1944, Hungary could tell that Germany was losing the war, and the government began to negotiate peace terms with the Allies. To prevent these efforts, German forces occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944.
And here is the bridge. It used to be a railroad bridge. It is a different one because the original was done. This is the new bridge that was put up after. And on March 19, 1944, on a Sunday, we were out here to row boat during the weekend. And all of a sudden, we started seeing German aeroplanes, bombers flying and circling about the bridge and about this area. So we saw something was wrong. We walked toward the bridge, and there were the SS soldiers standing there with their machine guns. And we went home. And when we got home, we found that many people were already taken into railroad cars that are to be heard from later on. And our life completely changed.
The situation in Budapest became very rough. Jews were arrested, some immediately executed, some taken to concentration camps. They were ordered to wear a 4-inch diameter Jewish star on their outside clothing and not to be on the streets after sundown. As a healthy 20-year-old man who was able to do hard work, my dad was taken to forced labor camp on April 17, 1944. He was ordered to report in with only the clothes on his back and food to last 3 days. On the last night together in their apartment, my dad remembers they had Wiener Schnitzel, his dad said to him, "You have finally grown to an age where I can have fun with you, and they are taking you away from me." He also said, "I know the Allies will win this war, but I'm not sure we will live to see the day." He was partially right. My dad's unit was marched toward the Russian front to dig ditches in no man's land for fortifications. There were over 40,000 camps in the Nazi system, and my dad's camp was one of these. It wasn't a name camp. They were ordered to cut down 100-foot-high fir and pine trees in the Carpathian Mountains, then carry the cleaned-up trunks down the steep mountain slopes and build roads with them so the military convoys could drive over the mud. While they did this, rockets flew over their heads in both directions. They worked from 4 in the morning until 9, 10 at night. After work, they stood in formation for roll call, at times for hours. Dad had no winter clothing, just the clothing he reported to camp with in April. He slept in it, worked in the snow and the rain with it. His daily food was a cup of black coffee, a cup of watered down bean soup, and a tiny piece of bread. Eventually, there wasn't even the bread. But Dad did what he could to resist. He had his prayer shawl with him, and even though he was dead tired, he would wake up 30 minutes early each morning to pray. Just being able to pray, to do something he had always done, gave him strength. Fortunately, 3 of Dad's friends were with him in the camp.
In labor camp, the way to exist and to survive was to be together with somebody. 3 of my friends and I decided to live as brothers. Everything 100% for each other, not as individuals. And we shared everything. We did everything together. And we slept touching each other, completely close to each other, because this way the 2 guys who were in the middle were warm. Then we switched. So the other 2 guys get in the middle.
Dad would tell stories about one of these men who provided much needed optimism. When one of them complained, this man would say that they should be happy since the weather is sunny. When it started to rain, he would say, "Yes, but we still have our shoes." When their shoes fell apart, he would say, "Yes, but our feet are not yet bloody." Dad said he was a good friend to have there. And you know what? All 4 men survived, and they remained friends for the rest of their lives. 2 of the men stayed in Hungary, 1 moved to Israel, and my dad came here. Here's a picture of 3 of the men before the war. And here they are in Israel in 1967. One day they had to cross a small but very fast river. They held on to each other so they wouldn't be swept away by the current. Sometimes Russian airplanes flew overhead and strafed them. They held their shovel, their only equipment, over their heads for protection, as if a shovel could protect them from a bullet. My dad was lucky. He didn't get hit. Some of Dad's stories were just unreal. He said you couldn't believe that one human would be so cruel to another. He said there were no rules, just the whim of the commander.
A very minor punishment was tie your hands together and like an animal in this fashion, they pulled you up onto a rope similar to English. And when your body is out, you like this, you pass out, then they let you down, war, pull up again. They were really just very, very cruel, at least cruel people, unreal people. You cannot imagine any nationality would do it. But as I started saying, yes, it can happen again. We are not any different than they were. They are not worse or better. So we have to very much watch so it doesn't happen again.
Dad always said that he survived because he was lucky. And that's true. There's an element of luck in every survivor's story. But Dad also made his own luck. He told himself he was going to survive, and he did whatever it took to survive.
When I went into labor camp, I was doing all kinds of work there, building roads, cutting trees. At one point they were asking, is there an engineer here? Of course, there was no engineer because Jews weren't accepted in the university, so there were no Jewish engineers. And after they asked it again, I put my hand meekly up and said, I am not an engineer, but I'm an engineering student, which I was not. And as a result, they put me into an office to do drafting work, which was much better than cutting trees and building roads. And I listened to marvelous stories by Hungarian officers saying, you see that bridge there? Before we move out of here, they're going to put your whole battalion on that bridge. We are going to blow up the bridge and you in the same time. And similar good-natured stories the marvelous Hungarian officers were telling us.
He outwitted his guards another way also.
1944, August 13. It was frost on the ground. We were up in the mountains high up, and I said to myself, if I have to be here during the winter, I will die. So I have to do something. And at one point I fell while cutting big pine trees, and I did a slight bruise on my hip. And luckily that bruise turned blue, and I stayed down, and I can't move. I stayed down eventually, and I can't move. And they threatened me that they'll shoot me if I can't. And I gambled. And I said, I cannot move. I must have broken my leg. And they didn't shoot me. Another luck. And they took me to a field hospital where they attempted to, this was relatively decent time yet, August 44. They took x-rays of my hip that had obviously no problem at all other than a slight bruise. And I kept on moving during the x-ray. So every time they took the picture, it was ruined, it was fuzzy. So they took new pictures, and eventually they moved me back from that area, away from that cold area, from up in the mountains.
Of course, during all this time, Dad had no contact with his family and didn't know what was going on in Hungary. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, Nazi Germany's chief deportation expert Adolf Eichmann and his Hungarian accomplices deported over 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Jews from all regions of the country, except those living in Budapest, were deported. Thus, the Hungarian Jewish community was subjected to the most ruthless and concentrated destruction process of the Holocaust. Ultimately, of the 825,000 Hungarian Jews who lived in Hungary before the war, 70% were murdered. All of my dad's relatives, except for his parents, lived outside of Budapest. Therefore, his grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins were all deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were immediately gassed. The head of the Hungarian government, Miklos Horthy, stopped the deportations in July and tried to reach a truce with the Soviet Union, whose army was on Hungary's borders. Horthy didn't stop the deportations to save the Jews. He did it to save himself. The Allies were threatening to arrest him for war crimes. But in mid-October, the Germans ousted Horthy and installed into government the radically anti-Semitic Arrow Cross Party. The Arrow Cross ordered the remaining 70,000 Jews in Budapest into a ghetto covering an area of just a few blocks. Several thousand Budapest Jews were also marched on foot to the Austrian border. This is exactly what happened to my dad's parents. On October 20th, Nazis came into the apartment building where they lived and took every male, including his dad. They marched them west toward Austria. My dad never found out definitively what happened to his dad, but from facts he learned after the war, believes that he was taken to Mauthausen, the concentration camp in Austria. Soon after that, his mother was forced into the Budapest ghetto. She lived in one room together with 15, 20 other people. Of course, with no medical attention. If someone got sick, he or she died. His mother survived and was liberated, but was so sick by that time that she died soon after. While this was happening in the fall of 1944, my dad's unit was marched toward Austria, several hundred miles away. Along the way, if you couldn't make it, you were shot. He survived because he was relatively strong, he was 20 years old, and most importantly, he was lucky. Once he tried to escape.
There was one time when I tried to escape when I knew that the Russians are coming closer to the place where we were. This was in Galicia. And I stayed back with a friend of mine, and we hid in the haystack in a peasant house. And my group left. We saw the Hungarian peasant go to the SS and reporting that a couple of Jews are hiding in the haystack. So we ran out and we ran after our group. And a Hungarian officer caught me and started screaming at me. He took me next to a ditch, took his gun off, pointed at me, and he said, "Jew, jump," so he doesn't have to bury me. And I was absolutely frozen. I stared at him, and I didn't jump. And at that point, a higher ranking officer came over to this one and took him away for some other duty, and I ran away. This is what I consider luck.
Eventually, they reached a brick kiln where instead of bricks inside the kiln, it was Jews. This is when his labor camp became a concentration camp. They did nothing all day, just exist inside this dark structure.
And we were in the brick kiln, lying next to the guy. Next to me was a quite famous engineer from Hungary. I happen to know his name. And he died next to me. And I did not report his death. But this way I could get next day's meat soup. And I could eat it. So I slept next to a dead one. So what? One day they were coming there. They said we'll need volunteers for work. Lots of us volunteered because the worst thing was to be inside the kiln next to sickly people. Most of us got typhoid fever. I got typhoid fever. I survived because I was lucky. And I volunteered where I was selected. And what was the work? We were burying some of the bodies. While doing that, somehow I got hold of the apple. So I lay down in the grave next to the dead one. It was, it ate my apple. Didn't bother me.
Some of the stories were just horrific.
One of my mates there said he was sleeping on a cigar box under his head. And I kept asking him, what is in the box? And he wouldn't tell. And one day he says, come on, I'll show you. He opened it up. There were a few black, I don't know what they were. I didn't know what they were. And I asked him, I said, what are those things? Black something. And he said, these are my toes. His toes froze, and he tore his toes up and saved it in the cigar box and slept on it.
Dad said you became a non-person. The Nazis stripped you of your humanity. You did things you would normally never do. Anything just to survive. Dad was liberated on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. One day, the Nazi guards just disappeared. Soon, a Russian soldier sauntered in. Dad figured he was free. He looked to the sun, knew that Budapest was to the east, and started walking. You can see on this map just how far he walked, about 130 miles. Today, that would take 2 hours driving on the highway. It took him 16 days to walk home, arriving on April 17th, 1945, exactly 365 days after he was taken. When he got home, he found his mom, who had been liberated in January. She was still alive, but very sick. Her first words to him were, "God kept me alive so that there would be somebody here to tell you what happened during this year." From memory and from some records, my dad drew his family tree on a 7-foot-long piece of paper. Of the more than 100 relatives on it, only 3 survived. Remember this picture? Dad weighed 70 pounds. Think of that, about half the weight he was just 1 year earlier. 21 years old, and he weighed 70 pounds. And what did he do? The very next day, after getting home, he enrolled in university because he knew that an education was the key to rebuilding his life. He said, "My parents wanted me to be an engineer. By gosh, I'm going to be an engineer." So I said that my dad was born Gyorgi Ungar. He changed his name to Kennedy for a couple of reasons. First, and most importantly, Ungar is a German word. It means Hungarian. After the war, he wanted to take back his identity and erase all connections to anything German. Also, he knew that he was coming to the United States, and he wanted a name that would work in both countries. He looked in the phone book and found 2 names that he thought would work, Kennedy and Gordon. He flipped a coin, heads or tails. Kennedy won. And that's how Gyorgi Andor Ungar became George Andrew Kennedy. Dad was often asked if he felt anger toward what happened to him. Changing his name was one way he expressed his anger. Also, Jews typically fast on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. However, right after the war, Dad questioned God.
After the war, a number of us friends were together on Yom Kippur Day. It was just after coming home, the first Yom Kippur, and we were talking about what happened during the war. And quite commonly reoccurring sentence was, "Where was God when all this happened? That he didn't stop that, he allowed this to happen to families to be killed and disappearing completely." And as a sign of resistance against God, up to then we were naturally fasting on Yom Kippur. We went to the kitchen. I remember I picked up a green pepper and I started eating it to demonstrate my where the hell were you?
Your rebellion.
Rebellion, yes.
Protest.
Eventually, after a few years, I was not fasting for a few years. Then I came back to it, and today I fast again.
In 1946, when Dad was in college in Budapest, a friend told him about an academic scholarship to the United States through Hillel, a Jewish organization. Dad applied, and again, luck, was one of the 1% of applicants who were accepted. In November 1947, he arrived to Texas A&M University. Knowing very little English, he had to learn Texan English. With no other Hungarians with him, he was forced to assimilate very quickly. He graduated and then applied for another scholarship to get his master's degree, this time to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. From there, he moved to Chicago and got a job at an engineering firm. He met my mom, who was born and raised in Chicago, on a blind date, and they were married 8 months later. My dad became the successful engineer that his parents always wanted him to become. He felt that they sacrificed their lives for him. He said he never would have applied for that scholarship if they were still alive. One of the more impressive jobs of his business career occurred just 9 years after he founded his engineering firm and less than 20 years after liberation, when the Army Corps of Engineers commissioned him to design new headquarters for the 5th U.S. Army. As Dad said, only in America. Dad embraced life, had a sense of adventure, and enjoyed traveling, sculpting, playing tennis, and most of all, being with his family. He emphasized the values of family, education, and hard work to my sister and me, and we in turn instilled those values into our kids. Unfortunately, Dad died too early at age 86 because of an accident. He hit his head falling off of a step stool while changing a light bulb, and 5 days later, played tennis, had lunch with some friends, ran some errands, and then came home to watch Jeopardy with my mom. He said he had a headache, went to take a nap, and never woke up. Dad always said that he won, that he was the victor, that he was here, that they didn't succeed in killing him. And this is what winning looks like. This picture of my mom, my sister, and I, and our families was taken 2 years ago. And since then, 2 more kids have been born. My dad was so proud of all of us. I'll close with Dad's final message.
If one thing stays with you, it should be that if something bad happens, start speaking up against it at the very beginning. That's the easiest time to do it, not when it is already out of bed and can start. Thank you very much.
Dad's message holds true today, maybe even now more than ever. Stand up, speak up, use your voice, be an upstander, and like Dad, embody life. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. We do have a couple of questions. Linda has asked, how old were you when your dad told his story?
I was a senior in high school, so 17, 18, probably 17.
Okay, and real quick, Ken Cooper and Allie Block from the museum say hello, and thank you for sharing your story and all you do for the museum. How were these pictures saved that you've shared?
You know, that's a really interesting question. My dad brought a small, and it was this copies of like his relatives were scans from actually the photo album. It's maybe 8 inches by 9 inches. And he brought that with him. Remember, his mom was still alive and she moved from their apartment into the ghetto. So she must have brought that album with him. I know my dad said they did bury some of their possessions in their yard or in this somewhere. And after the war, he did go back and retrieve some of his items. So he brought them with him when he came to the United States.
Okay. And when did he start speaking in public schools?
He probably started speaking when the Museum Foundation originally started. He was an active speaker with the museum, and he spoke everywhere. He would speak in Illinois, but he would travel. He felt it was so important, and he would speak at schools on the south side of Chicago. He would speak in Highland Park, but he would speak anywhere. He just felt it was so important to get the word out.
Brilliant. What was it like growing up as a child of a survivor?
That's a question I definitely get a lot. And I will say it was hard. He was very demanding. He raised my sister and I to be survivors. And in hindsight, it's so easy to look back. But in 1955, my dad had his undergraduate and graduate degrees. He was living in Chicago, married, had a baby, had started his own engineering firm 10 years after being in the concentration camp. It's crazy to me to think about that. So I guess I understand why he was so hard on us. But of course, at the time, I just knew that he was a very demanding
father. Why did you get involved with the museum and start sharing his story?
Because it's our turn. My sister probably started speaking about a year before I did. The two of us actually traveled to Lithuania with the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, and this trip was so eye-opening. We were traveling with Father Patrick Dubois. We saw these fields where Jews had been, mass murdered, And we both got home and said, okay, it's our time now.
Okay, and I think I've got one more question. What do you want people to kind of take away or learn from hearing your father's story?
No, I think that his final message is really the message that is so valuable. Speak up, use your voice, say something at the very beginning. That's the time to do it, as he says, before it gets out of hand. And really, just most importantly, use your voice. Your vote is your voice. So please vote and just be an upstander.
Okay, we did just get one more. Did your dad ever return to Europe?
Yes, often. That was one thing. He went back alone. He went back with my mom. He brought my sister and brother-in-law. I unfortunately was pregnant, so I couldn't join them, but he felt it was very important. He stayed in touch with his friends. He always would go back. He went to the Jewish school in Budapest that he went to. He went to the reunion. So yes, he would go back to Budapest. He never entered Hungary, or he never entered Germany.
All right, that looks like all the questions we have, so I will let you sign off.
Thank you again for joining us. Join us here next Wednesday, October 14th at 10 a.m. to hear Holocaust survivor Steen Metz share his story of survival. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.